So the Welsh government has announced its plans to make it easier for people to change gender. Welsh First Minister Mark Drakeford is set to ask the UK government for permission to have the powers in order to introduce these gender reforms. Ella, I mean, we've just had the debacle in Scotland over gender self-ID. It seems to have done significant damage to Nicola Sturgeon's credibility and that of the SNP. Why on earth is Mark Drakeford following in her footsteps?
Well, why on earth does Mark Drakeford do anything that he does? I mean, he's not exactly a politician that has covered himself in glory, and people will remember his legacy throughout the pandemic. But I think at this point it's very hard to not be cynical in relation to these kind of announcements about gender reforms, where this literally looks like a competition as to what devolved government can be the shiniest, best, most kind of rainbow-coloured institution. Any sensible politician would look at in a kind of cold, sort of sanguine, sensible way, look at the mess that has taken place just in terms of the creation of legislation in Scotland, how it was not going to work in relation to coming into contact with equality law in the rest of the UK, the fact that so many people were opposed to it, both in Scotland and outside of Scotland. And why would you then want to do something similar? Why would you want to piss off so many people, basically, on the basis of such a small minority of activists who push for this kind of gender reform? And I think it tells you something about the way in which how unserious actually so much of the pushing for greater gender reforms, greater access to self-ID, downplaying of the importance and truth of sex difference is. It's just this kind of game where it seems like now as who can piss off Westminster the most. And, the people who lose out to the greatest extent in this game is, the whole of wider society that's watching politicians lie to us, but also is, everybody listening to this podcast knows how much I hate talking about women as, minority groups and talking about women as vulnerable groups and all of that. But, women who are accessing single sex spaces like rape crisis centres are having to constantly defend those spaces against this kind of crap legislation. And, you can understand why people are getting pretty sick and fed up of it now.
Rakib, within a couple of days of the UK government blocking Nicola Sturgeon's bill, there was the news of one rapist who claimed to be transgender being transferred to a women's prison. Another one came out a few days after that. It was a man arrested for stalking, but also had a very violent history in prisons, and he was due to be sent to a women's prison. And now this week we've had the story about a transgender kidnapper who presumably, if none of this row had become so public, if it hadn't embarrassed the SNP, would probably be on his way to a women's prison if he were found guilty. I mean, what does it say about our political class that they either ignoring this or just don't see it as an issue?
I just think that I just don't understand why radical transgenderism would be a political hill to die on.
Yeah,
for some of these politicians, I find it remarkable. I thought Ella's recent appearance on Question Time was excellent, and I think that what it also showed, though, is that when this issue, when it gets into more traditional working class communities, and you have many of those in Glasgow, many people are brought back to reality on this issue. I think that when you're looking at the issue of gender self-identification, I think we really have to be honest about the threat to the integrity of sensitive female-only spaces. That's including rape crisis centres, domestic violence sanctuaries, also the threat that it poses to the integrity of women's sports. But Ella makes a very important point. This is just ultimately a matter of truth, isn't it? And I think that people who are just looking to ignore the biological realities of sex, they're ultimately doing a grave disservice to the common sense of the majority of the British public. So I do also think that more generally, when you're looking at this politically, I think that there could be a tension now within the Labour Party here between the Welsh Labour Party and the British-wide Labour Party, you could say, which is headed by Sir Keir Starmer. So I think that it's a real tension which is emerging on the left, a tension, in my view, that I find it remarkable that it even exists.
Rakib brings up a really interesting point, which is that, not only do we have governments, devolved governments and national governments warring with each other in terms of how to implement or block this kind of legislation, but there's now going to be rifts within political parties, and we know that there's this kind of sense of bad faith going on, and it was made quite obvious during question time with my interactions with the SNP minister Jenny Gilruth, who is married to Kezia Dugdale from the Labour Party. Kezia Dugdale is an individual who, up until not so long ago, was very critical of these kind of gender reforms, was, quite sensible on it. And then, the tide turns and they suddenly start parroting the stuff that that they don't believe is true. I mean, it can't be the case that, for example, SNP politicians who know the law in Scotland, which is that that a male rapist is, charged on the basis that he has, penetrated someone with a penis. That you cannot, why would you not be able to use the word male and the pronouns he for that person if you didn't understand Scottish law? So there is this sense, I think, that most people have, which is, whatever sort of you think about the extent to which you agree with gender critical side, or where on the kind of in the debate you are on this, it's very clear to everyone that politicians aren't telling the truth of what they actually think. They're just so terrified either way of coming down either side on this. I think it's quite remarkable that there's been a change in terms of, you don't hear politicians say anymore, trans women are women. And yes, I believe that people who, that have transitioned, have cervixes and all the rest of it, they've kind of been a bit cowed from that, but they're still not telling the truth. And so I think we just have to keep pushing to say that, and, politicians shouldn't be lying to the public. And, if it does bring up some kind of rifts in political parties, then good. I think this is a debate that has to be had much more publicly and much more loudly.
It was great to see on Question Time last week, Ella, your pushing of the SNP minister produced her to essentially argue that there are three genders: men, women and rapists. But there you go.